Last time I was in this city, it was in 1965. So before anybody in this room was born.
No.
And it was in a different country and a different epoch. So it's a great pleasure to be back. It's still very green. And as far as I can see, some things are still standing from when I was here in those far-off days. Now, I've changed my title. I'm not going to talk about memory. And for those of you who feel affront, you can walk out now in protest. But if you would like the talk that I would have given on memory, if you email me, I will send it to you. Okay. I'm not giving it because I have a very short attention span. I get bored very easily. And I became interested in talking about something else. And I think what I'm going to talk about is something else. Is about clothing, so I hope I will anticipate some of the other talks in this morning's program. But the reason I want to talk again about clothing, something I've talked about on and off since Dolly was born in 1960. When? 1996. 1996. And announced in Nature in 1997. Some of you will know that there was a recent paper relevant to cloning published just on the 6th of last month, the 6th of May, in the journal Cell. And it's because of that publication that I want to talk again about cloning. The publication in Cell described the successful cloning of human embryonic stem cells and has been taken by many to have reopened the possibility of safe human reproductive cloning. And so that is really what I want to talk about today. What happened in the work in Cell, which was undertaken in the US, they got to work by adding caffeine, which was a neat trick. And I quote, by adding caffeine to cell cultures, we were able to produce one embryonic stem cell line using just 2 human eggs, which would make this approach practical for widespread therapeutic use. But as a leading newspaper in the UK commented just after this paper was published, the announcement was also greeted with horror. Quote, scientists have finally delivered the baby that would-be human cloners have been waiting for. A method for reliably creating cloned human embryos, end quote. And David King of Human Genetics Alert went on to say, it is imperative we create an international ban on human cloning before any more research like this takes place. It is irresponsible in the extreme to have published this paper, end quote. And several of so-called tabloid newspapers or popular newspapers also carried banner headlines talking about the cloning danger and so on. It's worth thinking again, though, and that's what I want to do this morning, about whether there really is a danger. Now, the danger at the moment is negligible because there is an almost universal international ban on human reproductive cloning. Now, when Dolly was born, I actually I wrote about this at the time in the Journal of Medical Ethics in the end of, when was it? In the end of 1997. And I've been sort of writing about it ever since. Now, these 2 graphs were found by my colleague Cesar, who's sitting over there. They show from Google Trends the pattern of interest in cloning, which spiked in 2004. That's the first spike you can see. And that coincided with the publication of my book on cloning, so that must be the explanation of the surge of interest at that point. And then these other 2 spikes that you can see towards the end of the otherwise pretty continuous decline was when Barack Obama spoke about cloning and re-emphasized that he also thought it ought to be banned. Now, I don't think so. I think the objection to the idea of human reproductive cloning is absurd. And I want to explain why, but I want to start with just reminding you all, if you've forgotten, how universal and, I think, silly, as we say in technical language, silly, meaning stupid, the reactions to cloning had been. When Dolly's work was reported in Nature on February the 27th, 1997, the reaction, as I say, was hysterical. Bill Clinton, who was then President of the United States, some of you may remember him, called immediately for an investigation into the ethics of such procedures, and he announced a moratorium on spending, state spending in the US on human cloning. He said, and I quote, "There is virtually unanimous consensus in the scientific and medical communities that attempting to use these cloning techniques to actually clone a human being is untested and unsafe and morally unacceptable." Now, he was right about the first two. It was untested, and it may or may not be still unsafe. I'll come on to that in a moment. And it's not clear whether Clinton was being clever or just inadvertent by linking it being morally unacceptable with it being untested and unsafe. If it is unsafe, of course, that is a sufficient reason for not doing it, and you don't need to worry about the ethics, except the ethics of doing something that is unsafe. George W. Bush repeated this ritual genuflection, as I might call it, in the direction of hostility to cloning. And he said, again, pretty near the time, "I strongly oppose human cloning, as do most Americans. We recoil at the idea of growing human beings for spare parts." That's a different issue, which, again, we can talk about. And he went on to say, "or creating life for our convenience." Well, in fact, we are all grown for spare parts. That's what we're here for. There is a huge and wonderful life-saving practice of using spare parts, both from living and from dead human beings, for therapeutic purposes, and long may it continue. Thousands of kidney transplants are performed, many from live donors. Also, you'll be familiar with blood transfusion. That's pretty common and pretty unexceptionable, and yet, of course, it is using one another for spare parts, and I'll come back to that as well. I just want to recite a few of the other reactions, because it's worth just thinking about both how overwhelming and how stupid they all are. Members of the European Parliament demanded at the time that each member state of the European Union, as it then was, enact binding legislation prohibiting all research on human cloning and providing criminal sanctions for any breach. The European Parliament rushed through a resolution on cloning, the preamble of which asserted, and again I quote, "The cloning of human beings cannot under any circumstances be justified or tolerated by any society, because it is a serious violation of fundamental human rights and is contrary to the principle of equality of human beings, as it permits a eugenic and racist selection of the human race. It offends against human dignity, and it requires experimentation on humans." Well, so does most medical research, but we won't worry about that either. And the European Parliament resolution went on to say each individual has a right to his or her own genetic identity, and that human cloning is and must continue to be prohibited. And following on the European Parliament, the Council of Europe enacted the additional protocol to the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Dignity of the Human Being with regard to the application of biology and medicine on the prohibition of cloning of human beings. And it said, "Considering the purpose of the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, in particular the principle mentioned in Article 1, aiming to protect the dignity and identity of all human beings, we have agreed as follows: ban cloning." The United Kingdom government, I'm ashamed to say, my own government, was not exempt from this. On the 26th of June 1997, not long after the Nature announcement, the then Minister of Public Health stated, "We regard the deliberate cloning of human beings as ethically unacceptable." And the UK went on to rushed through the Human Reproductive Cloning Act in 2001, which was a one-line act of Parliament which just said, no cloning, thank you very much, we're British, or something like that. And not to be left out, last but not least, UNESCO, God help us. Their International Bioethics Committee rushed out a resolution on the ethics of cloning which demanded, and I quote, the preservation of the human genome as the common heritage of humanity, end quote. Well, so much for the pretty much universal condemnation of human cloning, which still exists today. There may even be people in this room who think it's a good idea to ban human cloning. I hope to convince you that you're wrong in the next 20 minutes. You've seen the Google Trends. Interest is waning. I now want to, that's a sort of long preamble to my discussion, I now want to look again at these objections to human cloning and see what they amount to. I'd like to start with UNESCO being the most silly. The preservation of the human genome as the common heritage of humanity requires the prohibition of cloning. Well, it's very odd that, because in fact it's only cloning that preserves the human genome. Sexual reproduction, without sexual reproduction, continuously varies the human genome. Indeed, to the extent that it's often referred to as genetic roulette to reproduce sexually, because you combine in unpredictable ways two sets of 23 chromosomes, you combine and change, vary, that's where the individuality comes from, the human genome. So if you were really serious, if UNESCO were really serious about preserving the human genome, then cloning would be mandatory. In other words, it would be absolutely, because it's the only way you can actually preserve the genome intact. And of course we don't want to do that, but if that's the goal, if that's the moral objective, then cloning should be the only form of human reproduction. Now, so much for all of the other claims that it's a threat on individuality, and some, you may hear more about those in a minute from other speakers. That seems also to me to be absurd. Cloning is very frequent, we're very familiar with it. There's been cloning ever since there's been reproduction, and it's very frequent. The spontaneous cloning rate from sexual reproduction is 1 in every 270 births, 3 per 1,000. That's very frequent. Now, nature's clones, or God's clones, identical twins, seem not to be a great threat to humankind, or indeed to individuality. Nobody claims that monozygotic twins have no individuality, no rights. Nobody thinks when somebody knows that they're about to give birth to identical twins that this is a great tragedy. You don't say to a mother expecting kids, oh, how terribly sorry I am that you're expecting kids. How awful. This is an affront to human dignity. This is an outrage. It's been universally condemned. You really ought to think about selective abortion so that you only have one child. Nobody thinks that. Interestingly also, we know that thanks to another great birth, which happened a long time ago, the birth of Louise Brown via IVF, not the birth of Dolly the sheep. Of course, Louise Brown was not a clone, but since assisted reproductive technologies have been successful in allowing people to have children, the identical twinning rate has dramatically increased. In IVF, you produce many greater numbers of identical twins than in normal sexual reproduction, probably because you've so damaged the embryo in creating it in a dish that it falls apart in the uterus, and its falling apart creates twinning. And of course, it's not just twins that are produced, sometimes other multiples. You can have 3 and 4 identical births as a result. So the twinning rate in ART is 1 in every 40 to 80 births, not 1 as it is in natural reproduction in every 270 births. So it's very much more frequent. Since 1978, when Louise Brown was born, over 5 million babies have been created globally through assisted reproductive technologies. So this has dramatically increased the number of clones in the world. Now, nobody has advanced this, interestingly, as an objection to assisted reproductive technologies. We don't think that one of the curses of our technologically adroit times, which have enabled us to produce so-called test tube babies, is that the twinning rate, and hence the cloning rate, has increased. And of course, monozygotic twins are much more closely identical than clones produced by the Dolly method would be. Why? Because those twins not only have the same genome, but also they shared the same uterine environment, they were born simultaneously, so lots of other things are the same for both of them. If I were to clone myself, if that were possible now, which I have no interest in doing whatsoever, one of them is quite enough, I'm sure you would agree. And certainly if you don't agree now, you will agree by the time I finish speaking. Nonetheless, if I were to be cloned now, I'm 67 years old. So a lot has changed in the world. The education system is different. My clone would not share my mother's uterine environment. My mother died when I was 12, so no chance of that. It would be very much different from me, unlike monozygotic twins. So again, if we are worried about the closeness of the identity, whether genetic or in other traits which might be influenced by paternity, by education, by the uterine environment and so on, then the dangers from cloning of the Dolly sort are much, much less than they are from identical twinning. So, what do identical twins tell us? Well, they tell us that we're very familiar with clones, that they are very commonly occurring, that nobody thinks that this is a tragedy, and that insofar as something's being natural, or indeed according to the order created by God, counts for anything, which I don't think does count for anything, but for those who do think that something's being natural is an argument for it, or being God-given is an argument for it, then monozygotic twins, clones, are both natural, whatever that may mean, and God-given, whatever that may mean. Take another objection that is made to cloning. Cloning treats people as a means, not as ends in themselves. Many people have taken this view. One example from the time that Dolly was born was a paper by the French molecular biologist Axel Kahn, published in Nature, in which he said this: the creation of human clones solely for spare cell lines would, from a philosophical point of view, be in obvious contradiction to the principle expressed by Immanuel Kant, that of human dignity. This principle demands that an individual, and I would extend this, Kant said, to read human life, should never be thought of as a means, but also always as an end. Now, Kahn's paper was published in Nature in 1997, and I actually replied to his paper also in Nature just a few weeks later, criticizing the arguments that he took for many reasons. One is, of course, that we all treat one another as means to our ends. We all do it all the time. What I think Kant meant to say, and possibly did say, was that it is wrong to treat people only as a means to your own ends, not also as ends in themselves. So we all instrumentalize others, but we can get away with it so long as we're also prepared to respect them as ends in themselves. But even this is not true. We take the example of blood donation, which I mentioned earlier. Very common. Now, I don't know if anybody in this room has received a blood transfusion, transfusion of somebody else's blood, but I bet you didn't know where it came from. It comes in a plastic bottle. You have no idea about the identity. Do you care? You're lying by the roadside, victim of a truck that's just gone you down. Do you care where the blood that's going to save your life came from? Do you have any conception of the identity, the human dignity of the individual that's applied them? Of course you don't. You're just using it instrumentally to save your life. Of course you are. Why shouldn't you? And that's what it was given for. So why worry? Instrumentalization, I'm afraid, is very, very common indeed. What can we say on the plus side about cloning? Well, I think there is one very good thing to say about cloning, assuming we do it safely. On to safety in just a minute. And that is, cloning delivers a known genome, a tried and tested genome, road tested. So rather than the genetic lottery, you might, as a rational parent, not want to dice with the chance that that genetic lottery would throw up genetic mutations which would cause serious illnesses, and I'll come on to just how frequent those are in a minute. You might want the genome of somebody who's already lived a healthy life for 70 or 80 years, in wonderful health, full vigor. You might think, that's the genome for me. And they're intelligent, and everything else, not bad looking. You might say, that's the genome for me. Why take a chance? Why go into this irresponsible lottery, which can throw up mutations and all sorts? I want a really good road-tested genome that I can rely on for my kids. Seems to be a rational thing to do if it's safe enough, and I'll, again, as I say, come on to that. So, on the plus side, cloning can deliver a tried and tested genome rather than an unpredictable and often disastrous one. Well, let's look at these disasters for a minute. Sexual reproduction delivers a massive failure, total failure, doesn't work 80% of the time. The failure rate for sexual reproduction, it ends in nothing. Not an embryo or an embryo that doesn't survive, 80% failure rate. And an 8% abnormality rate. Just let me give you a sense of what that means. And I quote from a recent study of this: every year, an estimated 7.9 million children, 6% of total births worldwide, are born with a serious birth defect of genetic or partially genetic origin. Additional hundreds of thousands more are born with serious birth defects of post-conception origin, including maternal exposure to environmental agents, teratogens, such as alcohol, rubella, syphilis, iodine deficiency, and so on, that can harm the developing fetus. So, 80% failure rate. What does that mean? It means that everybody sitting in this room is here over the dead bodies of between 3 and 5 of their siblings that die in utero at a very early stage, probably in the first month after conception, were washed out with the menstrual flow. Nobody noticed, not least of all the mother, but that's what happened. That's the failure rate. So, if you value the life of the embryo, you don't want to have sexual reproduction. In fact, the only embryo-sparing method of having sex is to use condoms. So if you're Catholic, actually what you should be doing is using condoms if you don't want to kill embryos, because every other way of reproducing kills embryos. Condoms are the answer. Of course, you don't get any children either, but that's a small price to pay for preserving the life of embryos, you might think. So, very high failure rate, and as I say, an 8% abnormality rate, which doesn't sound much, but in fact, globally, that is 7.9 million children a year with serious genetic defects. I think that sexual reproduction is grossly irresponsible. If it had been invented as a reproductive technology, rather than sort of found as part of our evolved biology, it would never have been licensed. We'd never have got governments to approve of exposing their populations to a technology so monstrously and irresponsibly dangerous, with a massive failure rate and a very high abnormality rate. So, sexual reproduction ain't safe. So when we think about what's safe enough, we have to bear in mind comparison with the gold standard, and the gold standard, everybody believes, is sexual reproduction. Well, it's fool's gold if what you're worried about is survival and being mutation-free. So, to sum up this part of the presentation, the arguments against reproductive cloning, except the safety arguments, are a bunch of prejudices. If you look at the resolutions that I recited at the beginning of my talk, none of them provide any arguments. They just assert it as a fact that it is that cloning is wrongful, that it is an attack on human dignity, that it prevents individuality. What nonsense, of course it doesn't. And we have a very good example that shows all of that from monozygotic twins, from identical twins. They do have individuality, it's not a disaster, and so on. The arguments then are simply as to whether or not human cloning can be safe enough. Now, rather than worrying about this, we should do research. It's probably not safe enough to license human reproductive cloning at the moment. We just don't know enough about it. But research like the research published in Cell just a few weeks ago makes it probable that we can clone human embryos reasonably successfully. So we should do some research and see whether that is true. Now, ultimately, of course, we're going to have to, again, as the English expression has it, take a fly on the result. That's what happened with the birth of Louise Brown, the first test tube baby. Now, the two men who made that happen are now both dead, unfortunately, Patrick Steptoe and Bob Edwards. Bob Edwards died just, I think it was this year, having very belatedly received the Nobel Prize for his work on IVF. Unfortunately, I knew Bob quite well. Unfortunately, at the time when he was too deranged with dementia to even be aware that he had won the Nobel Prize, although he was still alive. I don't think he was awarded as he would have had to be, because Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously. A very interesting thing. When Louise Brown was born all those years ago, I was very excited by this. I thought, as I always am when I read the newspapers about scientists do, I thought, this is great! Something else for philosophers to talk about. And I contacted Bob Edwards, who was then a reader in embryology at Cambridge, and we became quite close over the years. I saw him frequently. I was involved in the foundation of his online journal, and he told me the story of how he and Patrick Steptoe had got together to create the first IVF baby. And he had heard Patrick Steptoe, who was a gynecologist, talking on the radio, saying if only we could do this scientifically, we might be able to treat infertility in a whole class of women who are not able to conceive naturally. And Bob was sitting in his laboratory in Cambridge saying, I can do that, I can do that, I do it every day with mice. And he got on the phone to Patrick Steptoe and said, your search is over. I can show you how to do that with humans. And they did, and they didn't know whether it was safe or not. But a wonderful example of moral luck. I'm not saying it was responsible to go ahead with the birth of the production, if you like, of Louise Brown. But they were lucky. It proved to be a very, very safe procedure. Now, ultimately, all science that we use has to take that step from the laboratory to use in humans if it's going to be of human benefit. And you never know quite what will happen. But that's true. Everything that we benefit from, vaccines and so on. But at least it is rational to try and get to the point where we can seriously consider whether the benefits of doing it in humans are worth what residual dangers may be anticipated. I want to end by telling a story that I love telling. Some of you who've heard me speak before may have heard me tell this story, but it is a salutary reminder of the dangers of preserving the human genome intact, whatever that may mean, as the common heritage of humankind. Some people in this room are quite interested in human enhancement. One person sitting in front row is one of them. And if you think that it might be good to enhance human beings, including by genetic means, to make us more durable, more resistant to disease, longer lived, healthier, and you can do that genetically, then you don't believe in preserving the human genome intact as the common heritage of humankind. There's a lovely story told by another notorious Englishman, Richard Dawkins. Some of you may know as a famous evolutionary biologist and popularizer of evolution, but also as a very famous atheist. In a lovely essay called Gaps in the Mind, he tells this story, and I can't resist retelling it, though you may know it. He asks us to imagine a contemporary human woman. I'm going to stick, as Richard Dawkins does, with women because it makes the genetics slightly easier. Here's a contemporary human woman standing on the coast of Africa. There's Europe up there. There's South Africa and the South Pole down there. Here is the west coast of Africa. The sea is right here. She's standing on the coast of Africa, looking north. And in her right hand, she holds the hand of her mother. Here's her mother, one step in, and in her right hand, she holds the hand of her mother. Each mother and daughter look as much like mothers and daughters as mothers and daughters normally do. And you imagine this human chain, mothers and daughters, stretching back into Africa, each taking up about 1 meter of space, until about 300 miles, I think I'm going to get 300 miles out of this room, about 300 miles into the continent of Africa, not a very big slice of Africa on the map, we come to our common ape ancestor around 7 million years ago, stretching in an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters back to the coast. And our common ape ancestor is holding in her other hand her daughter. And so on back to the coast. And when this U-shaped human chain of mothers and daughters is complete, we find 2 contemporary women staring at one another on the coast of Africa. One, the contemporary human woman, and another, a chimpanzee, a female chimpanzee. Now that is an interesting story about the connectedness of us, the seamlessness of our connection with our common ape ancestor, 7 million or so years ago. It is totally seamless, and it has resulted in very different evolutionary stories. It's not that we're descended from chimpanzees, we're not. We and chimpanzees are both descended from a common ape ancestor. And one of the things that makes us humans a species, namely our capacity to mate sexually with one another, and not with any other species, is an accident of evolution. It is true that we can't without technology. We actually could do it now. Thanks to Emerson's steptoe, we could mate with other creatures now if we wanted to, using a bit of technology. But we can't do it sexually at the moment. But that's an accident of history. There's not something essentially different about us humans. The apes with which we could and did in the past breed have died out. And so the ones that are left we can't make it sexually. You may think that's a good thing, you may think it's a bit of a wasted opportunity either for the apes or for us. But either way, the uniqueness of our species identity, defined as species often are as those who have the capacity to reproduce sexually with one another, is an accident of evolution. But why I'm telling you this story is for a different reason. Imagine now our ape ancestor, 7 million years ago, holding her 2 daughters in her hand and thinking, possibly, thinking, this is great. Simian nature, what could be better? Let's make sure that the simian genome is preserved as the common heritage of simian kind in perpetuity. Well, if our ape ancestors had had the intelligence and the cooperative abilities to have that conversation, and indeed the linguistic abilities, which they probably didn't, certainly didn't, but if they had, they might well have decided, like UNESCO's absurd resolution, to preserve the simian genome intact as the common heritage of simian kind. And you and I would not be having this, I hope, agreeable conversation that we are having this morning in Zagreb. Now, I think that would be foolish for them, and I think the same is foolish for us at our stage of evolution. Evolution is not over. Darwinian evolution, of the sort that we have benefited from, if that is the right word, up to now, that has enabled us all to be sitting in this room together, it takes a very, very long time, about 7 million years, to effect dramatic change. But though change does come slowly, each mother looking as much like a mother and daughter as mother and daughters do, but in enough generations you get a dramatic difference. But we can speed up evolution now by a process that I've called enhancement evolution, which I described in my book, Enhancing Evolution, still in print, published by Princeton University Press in 2007. We can do that, and I think we should, if we can do it safely, and if we can see clearly ways in which we can improve ourselves, both genetically and in other ways. Now, I think there are obvious design flaws that, unfortunately, you and I share. We're wonderful creatures. We can do philosophy. You know, the very summit of the human mind, you might say. Those who are professional philosophers, and how could I disagree? But we can do better, and we can do quicker, what takes us a long time now. But we are also terribly defective. We are vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. We are vulnerable to the emergence of new diseases, HIV, avian flu, H5N1. New terrible diseases coming along all the time. We die prematurely. Many things go wrong in the combination of genes and sexual reproduction. We might be able to obviate in dangerous cases through cloning. Cases where two parents have a very high probability of reproducing a genetic defect, they might be better advised, if they want genetically related children, to clone one or both of themselves, rather than go in for the genetic lottery, which is less of a lottery in their case, because they know, because of the family history and because of genetic testing, that they have a 1 in 4 chance, let us say, of producing a very terrible, life-threatening defect in any child that they have. So cloning might be an option for them. But we can do better, and we have to do better. And I want to end on an optimistic note. I usually begin on this note, but I will end on it for today. We know two things about the future, for sure and certain, at least as sure and certainly as we can know anything about the future. Predicting the future, as you know, is not a wonderfully exact science, but I'm pretty confident in these two predictions. And they are that in the future there will be no more human beings, and in the future there will be no more planet Earth. We know that the latter is true because we know that our sun will die, and with it all possibility of organic life on this planet. That will happen in a few billion years, we know, as surely as we can know anything. And if we, or are genetically modified either through Darwinian evolution or through enhancement evolution, if we or our successors are still around when that happens, I don't think we will be any more like you and I are today than we are like our common ape ancestors. At least I hope not. But if we're still around then, we won't be human. We will have further evolved one way or another. Hence my first prediction will come true. And we will need to have found somewhere else to live, because this Earth will not be habitable anymore. We will need either to have found a new planet on which to live, or possibly, if our technology is dramatically improved, we will need to have built to do either of those two things, we have to be open to the future, and to a different future than the one we share now. For all these reasons, the absurd conservatism of the objections to human reproductive cloning needs to be combated. Not because reproductive cloning is a wonderful idea for reproduction at the moment. I've indicated one possible use for reproductive cloning, to get a tried and tested genome, particularly for people who have genetic illnesses that they can pass on. But it's not a wonderfully seductive technology. But we don't want to close, it seems to me, the door on anything unnecessary. What has happened in all of these discussions of cloning, and all of the reactions, is that cloning has been made as a conservative, sacrificial now. Because there are no very good uses for it, everybody has felt able to gather around and say, well, this is one of those wonderful places where we can draw a line in the sand and say science will not pass this line. I think that's a dangerous practice to get into. So it's not as if I'm sort of gung-ho about human cloning. I don't wish to clone myself. I don't know of anybody sensible who does at the moment, but there may be uses, and we don't wish, it seems to me, we should not wish to close our minds to possibilities that we may need, and we certainly should not get into the habit of castigating scientific practices when there is no need. So I think we need to rethink human cloning, not simply because the paper published in Cell last month holds out prospect of tailor-made therapies, tailor-made in the sense that they can be mapped to the genome of existing people in order to obviate dangers of rejection and so forth. We should welcome that research for that goal, that opportunity that it may offer for therapies, but we should also not be frightened of it and wish to close it down because it may lead to reproductive cloning. So what if it does? It will never be universal. For good or bad, people are going to continue with the genetic lottery, and they're going to continue reproducing sexually for all of the familiar reasons. Assisted reproduction of whatever sort, including cloning, is going to be a minority activity probably forever. So we don't have to have great worries about suddenly everybody replacing sexual reproduction with other forms of reproduction, although it might be a good thing if we did. One of the great liberating features of our times is that sex has, for most people on the planet, been separated from reproduction, or inseparable from reproduction, and that is liberating for many. So, don't worry about cloning. It may never happen. But whether that is a comforting thought or a disturbing thought, I leave with you. I rather think it's a disturbing thought. It's disturbing because we allow prejudice to govern our attitude